What is CAPIF? CAPIF is a standard defined by 3GPP, which aims to amplify the network and propose a series of standards to address and solve the exposure and consumption of APIs. So essentially, CAPIF serves as a directory of APIs, storing their specifications and related information for consumption. Within CAPIF, there are provisions for various aspects related to API consumption, including monitoring, securing, handling events, and more. As a first step, we have to understand that there are three main entities in CAPIF. The first, the CAPIF core function, or CCF, that is implemented by multiple microservices, each one in charge of a functionality defined by the specification of the 3GPP. And this is the list with all the microservices that make up the CAPIF. In addition to the list of services, in the implementation that we have made, we have added another auxiliary services, such as the register service, to provide credentials to invokers and providers the first time they want to connect to CAPIF. The Nginx, which is responsible for establishing a single entry point to the CCA and intercommunicating the different microservices. Vault, which is in charge of managing our CA and signing the invokers and provider certificates, and the MongoDB, which is our database where we store all the CAPIF information. Another entity will be the invoker, that is the equivalent of a client that consumes APIs. This invoker will have to register with CAPIF, discover the APIs, and consume them. And finally, we have the provider, that can be seen as the service provider, which in turn consists of three other entities. The API exposing function, or AEF, that is in charge of exposing the different services that are registered in CAPIF. The API publishing function, or APF, that is in charge of publish the different services. And the API management function, or AMF, that manages the provider, updating or deleting it, for example. What are we gonna see? This will be the complete flow according to the 3GPP specification, with all the requests made by providers and invokers in CAPIF. But this flow doesn't show the user registration or the token requests that aren't necessary and aren't defined in the specification. So the flow that we are going to follow for this demo is this, in which we are going to create a provider, we will publish an API, and later we will create an invoker to discover the published API and use it. The API that we are going to publish will allow us to create a new virtual machine in an OpenNebula instance. So our goal as an invoker will be to create a virtual machine using that API. And to do this, we are going to use a public CAPIF instance and two consoles that emulate an invoker and a provider, and that will make it easier for us to make the request to CAPIF. So let's start. To register or onboard the provider, first we need some data. And to obtain this data, we have created a register service where we will have to create a user. So we are creating user. Okay. So we made the request to the register service using the URL register to create the user, and in the body, we specified the username, password, short description, and important, the role. Now we want to register our provider, so we need to put the provider role. In response, we receive the ID of the user and the URLs that we need to use to make the onboarding and to publish the API. CAPIF use certificates as a security method, but onboarding is different and use a token. So the next step is ask the register for this token with the URL getout and the credentials of the created user. This will be the token that we are going to use, and it also returns us the CR root certificate that we will use to verify the authenticity of our certificates. Now we can do the onboarding. Well, now we make the request to CAPIF, not to the register service. We use the URL obtained from the register. The token also obtained from the route of the register. And before start with the body, a provider is made up of three functions: the AEF, the APF, and the AMF. So in onboarding, we need to create a TCR and a key pair for each of these functions to request a CAPIF certificate for each of these functions. So in the body, we have a list of functions, and we need to specify that we want an AEF function with this TCR, and APF with this TCR, and an AMF with this TCR. CAPIF, and then responds us with the location of the resource in the headers and in the body for each of the functions and ID and the certificate. In this case, this is for the AEF, this for the APF, and this for the AMF. Okay, now at this point, for each request, we need to use the corresponding certificate. In this case, as we want to publish an API, we need to use the APF certificate, its key, and the CR certificate that we obtained in the register. So we made the request to the URL obtained from the register, introducing the APF ID, and on the body, the description of the API with the API name, in this case, demo API 1 of OpenCAPIF, the profiles of the AEF that expose the API. In this case, we only have one AEF, so we put the AEF ID of that AEF, the list of the versions. We only have one version that expires in 1 year. The list of results. We have 3 URI with its operations and the interface description. Here we can put the IP, the host, the port, and the secure method. In this case, false. So CAPIF returns us in headers the location of the results and in the body the API ID of the service. So now we can run the API, and with this we finish the provider part. So now let's go to the invoker part. Okay. To create the invoker, we have a similar process that of the provider. We need to request the URLs and the token. Like the provider, we create the user using the register service. In this case, our role will be invoker, and we will obtain the URLs for the onboarding of the invoker and the discovery of APIs. Also the ID of the user that we created. We need to request the token for onboarding. So the same form, get out. We request to get out, and we receive the access token to make the onboarding and the CR root certificate to verify the authenticity of the certificate. We now make the request to CAPIF to register the invoker using the URL obtained from the register, the token, and in this case, we only need to create a CCR and a key of pair for the invoker, not like the provider that we need to create more. So we create the CCR, and in the field API invoker public key, we specify it. Then in response, CAPIF return us in headers the location, the result, and in the body, the invoker ID and the invoker certificate. At this moment, we will have to use for our request the invoker certificate, its key, and the CR root certificate obtained from the register. So the next step will be to see what APIs are public. For this, we make the request for the discover URL. Okay. Here, CAPIF responds us with a list of all the APIs that are published. In this case, our goal is use this API, demo API 1 OpenCAPIF, that is the API that we publish as the provider. Here we have all the information, the API name, API ID, the AE FID, the versions, and the results. And now we want to create with this API a virtual machine. But first, we need to request the access to that API, the authorization of that API. Using this URL, the security service URL of CAPIF. And here we specify the API ID that we want to use, the AEF ID that exposes this API, and our preferred security method. In this case, we only have one security method without, so we only put that method. And CAPIF responds with the location in headers of the results and the selected security method to use. In this case, we only pass one security method, so we selected OAuth. We are gonna use OAuth, so we need to request a token to invoke the API. Request token to this API. So the request of the token. We use this URL, like the security URL, but with token here. And the body we specify our invoker ID and what API for what API we want the token. This is specified in the scope. The scope follow this pattern. Pre-GPP hashtag the AEF ID followed by the API that it's supposed, the API name that is supposed. And with this, CAPIF returns the token that we need to use, the type of the token, in this case, bearer. When spikes, in this case, we have 600 seconds to use it. And the APIs that accepted this token. So now, finally, we can make the request to the service. Okay, and as you can see, we request to this URL that are in the Discover. We are using this the token that we get from the security service, the body that I know, and we created a virtual machine with this ID 293, and if I go here and I refresh, here we have a virtual machine named the demo 1 VM with this ID. So we have seen how to onboard a provider and an invoker. We have published an API in CAPIF, and we have seen how that API can be used.